The Garifuna people are a unique linguistic and ethnic group located in Central America. The history of the Garifuna goes back centuries, even before the colonization of the New World, of the island of St. Vincent. Then, in 1675, a slave ship from West Africa wrecked on the shores of this island. Both the indigenous Caribs and these new merged cultural elements to create a unique Garifuna language as well as a unique culture. These new Garifuna people lived side by side with the European colonizers until 1796, when they were stuck in the middle of a dispute between France and Britain, which saw them expelled from their native St. Vincent. The British then forcibly relocated them to the coast of Belize and Honduras, where they live to this day. The Garifuna continue to live in isolated communities in Belize, Honduras, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. Their diaspora maintains its traditions and cultures through its language and its musical traditions. However, the Garifuna language is at threat of being replaced by English and Spanish, which is central to most of its culture.
So, although the Garifuna people were moved around the Caribbean through French, British, and Spanish colonial forces, the Garifuna were not produced through force or power. They are indeed the product of indigenous American and African interactions, the fusion of Arawak traditions and the language with a variety of African cultures and traditions. While we didn't find any evidence of their culture as an act of resistance to European colonization and encroachment, today's effort to retain the Garifuna language is an act of resistance. It is the act of a people who believe that their culture and language are the same thing, and that the language must be preserved to retain their own identity. Given that they are the last living people associated with the Arawaks, they maintain knowledge and language that exists nowhere else on Earth. In a lot of Latin countries, the Garifuna people are just grouped with other African heritage people. So in the Caribbean, they're just black Caribs. The nuance and rich history of their culture is not present by that categorization, however. By pushing for their culture to be heard and remembered, they are bringing awareness to a group of people who have been neglected and forgotten, but are nonetheless distinct within the African diaspora. They are the descendants of slaves, but the preservers of an indigenous American language and culture blended with African tastes. That's something really special and something to be remembered and maintained. That's what they're doing. Thank you. So today we're going to be talking about the fusion of African culture and Latin American culture in the overall Garifuna culture, and we're going to be looking at Garifuna language. We're going to be looking at their dance, and we're going to be looking at their cuisine. So to start off with the language, there's a linguist, Douglas Taylor, and he studied the Garifuna language, and it was interesting because he noticed that the phonetics that the Garifuna people used to speak were very, very much African in nature. They retained that from Africa when they moved to Latin America. However, the language that they spoke was very Latin American. That retained that the Latin American vocabulary with an African spin, with the not with the African vocabulary, with the African phonetics in the way that they spoke. So that's an interesting combination of Latin American and African culture in their language. We can also see it in their dance. I'm pretty sure here you can see that they have drums. And percussion is also a big thing in their traditional dance. Their traditional dance is called punta. It's a traditional music, and it's a combination of African music and Latin American music. It's a combination of Latin American music, which commonly associate percussion instruments with, and distinctive drumming is something that you associate with African culture. So again, a kind of fusion mix of the two to create a unique culture in and of its own. That's not Latin American. That's not African. In any way, but that is a combination of the two cultures. The last thing that we can see this manifestation in, the combination of the two cultures, is in their cuisine. And I think it's the most telling here because when you cook, you have to use the ingredients that are available to you where you are. So they had to use Latin American ingredients, but they had to cater to an African taste. So it's a really telling combination of the two cultures. So this is a fish curry. It's got some African, some African foods in it. It's got fish, obviously for the protein, but it's got green banana, which is a common African thing that they used in the cooking. This is cassava root, which is commonly eaten with African food. They managed to bring it to Latin America to cook, to use it, to eat it. But this is the most telling dish. It's a Garifuna sort of tamale. Tamale is something you really associate with Latin America, but they managed to make it kind of African. They used plantains and they used green banana to make this tamale. Not things you commonly associate with what you put in a tamale, but again, it's that African Latin American fusion that we see present throughout their dance music, linguistics, and culture in general.
While most scholars mostly look at the Caribbean part of Garifuna ancestry, we must not neglect the African cultural significance to them. The slave ship carrying the original West Africans that intermixed with the native Caribs was originally from the southern coast of Nigeria and from the Ibibio people. The Garifuna language itself is seen as a mix of both Carib and also native African Bantu. However, Garifuna has very little shared vocabulary along with the West African languages. Only the words Mutu, meaning person, and Pinda, meaning peanut, being shared. However, Garifuna still exhibits many different grammatical influences from West African languages. Thus, it has been reasoned that through the mixing of the West African slaves and the indigenous Carib people, the Garifuna language inherited the Carib vocabulary, but most of the West African grammar. Carib culture. Even when they were forcibly removed to the coast of Belize and Honduras by the British, the Garifuna still managed to retain their culture. However, the helplessness of the Garifuna people must not be understated, as even today they are still a relatively small population. And we must remember the immorality of their displacement, as they were moved for no other reason than simply living on an island, contested by both the British and the more tolerant French. This helplessness and being stuck between two rival empires reminded me of the plight of the Cossacks during the 16 and 1700s, where both the Poles and the Russians took advantage of them.